The morning on the beach is quiet, too quiet. The seagulls are screaming, the waves are crashing. In a beach chair sits a man who will never see this day again. What begins as a peaceful morning soon turns into a complex murder case full of lies, power, and a collection of carefully guarded secrets. Because this death is no coincidence, it is staged. Before we dive in, if you love crime novels in which the saw slowly gets under your skin, then make sure to press the subscribe button right now. Don't worry, it won't hurt, and you won't miss any more murders by the sea. And now tell me, do you prefer listening to crime novel audiobooks in the evening to fall asleep or during the day? Write it in the comments. I'm curious. Lean back. The beach is beautiful. The case is deadly. The beach lay silent like a swallowed secret. Not a soul could be seen. Just the patient expanse of the sea and the pale light of a morning that had not yet decided if it wanted to show a friendly face or remain quite cold. The sky hung low, gray like unwashed wool, and somewhere above the dunes, the seagulls were screeching as if they had to reassure each other again and again that they were still there. The wind was coming off the water, cool and relentless, carrying the smell of salt, seaweed, and old wood across the beach. It swept through the rows of beach chairs, making the woven covers creak softly, as if they were whispering to each other. Basket number 17 stood a little apart. Not much, only half a step further forward than the others, just enough to be noticeable if you looked at it. The left hind leg was pressed deeper into the sand as if someone had failed to take care to align it properly, or as if someone had purposely chosen not to do so. The dead man was. At first glance, Ralph Bender appeared to be almost peaceful. With his upper body leaning back slightly and his hands hidden beneath the light gray wool blanket, which had been carefully pulled up to his chest. His head was tilted to the side, his chin slightly lowered, as if he had been suddenly overcome by a deep slumber. Only those who came closer could see the paleness of his skin, the peculiar rigidity that had nothing to do with rest. His shoes stood neatly in the sand in front of the beach chair, parallel to each other, the toes pointing towards the sea. The laces were neatly knotted. No sand on them, no haste, no stumbling. Too clean. Ralph Bender had been dead since 6:42 a.m., chairman of the building committee, local politician with firm handshakes and promoter of tourism, as every press release said. One of those people you knew, even if you didn't like them. Someone who knew how to make decisions without looking too dirty. Chief Inspector Neela Jensen stood a few steps away and proceeded to let her gaze wander slowly across the entire crime scene. She had learned to take her time, not to jump straight into the details, but to let the whole thing have its effect, as if the place itself would begin to tell a story if one were to only listen long enough. The beach was empty, cordoned off with red and white tape that fluttered in the wind. A strip of order in a landscape that otherwise paid no attention to human rules. Jensen zipped up her jacket. The cold crept up her legs from the sand. A damp, unpleasant cold that even with all your experience you could not entirely manage to ignore. She thought of coffee, of warmth, and pushed both aside. There would be time for that later. She knew immediately that this wasn't a self-explanatory death. A heart attack looked different and needed freezing to death. And even if you were to set all of it aside, this specific order remained. The blanket, the shoes, the way the body sat, as if someone had placed it there and had not simply let it fall to the ground. The beach chair was a stage, the victim a prop. Whoever had done this wanted you to see it. Who found him? Jensen asked, without taking his eyes off basket number 17. The landlord, answered Peterson from behind her. His voice sounded hoarse, as if he would have preferred to sleep through the morning. He was here early, wanted to check the baskets, said it was immediately obvious to him that something was wrong. Jensen nodded barely perceptibly. Check. Early. She filed the words away, adding them to the many others that would come today. She took a few steps closer, but then she came to a halt outside the area that had been marked off for the forensics team. The sand around the beach chair was surprisingly smooth. No smudged prints, no signs of a struggle, just a few seagull tracks that nobody cared about. It looks as if he had been sleeping right here, Peterson muttered, looking at the ground. Looks like someone wanted it to look that way, Jensen replied. She leaned forward slightly, examining the dead man's face. Ralph Bender had fine lines around his eyes that spoke of frequent smiles. Now they seemed as if etched in. His mouth was slightly open, as if he wanted to say something else, or as if he had lost his breath at the last moment. Jensen thought of all the times she had seen people dead who had looked more peaceful than they deserved to be, and of others whose faces even in death spoke in contradiction. Ben's face told nothing definitively. It was a mask smoothed by the cold. No visible injuries, Peterson said. Forensics are on the way. He didn't die here, Jensen said. Peterson looked at her. Sure? As sure as you can be before you prove it. She pointed to the shoes. Who takes their shoes off on the beach, puts them down like this, and then sits down properly to die? Peterson was silent. The wind tugged at his coat as if to urge him on. Jensen straightened up and let his gaze wander over the beach chairs. Rows of woven bodies, all the same, and yet with small differences. Some slightly faded, others newly painted. Property, numbered, managed. Each basket belonged to someone, and everyone who worked here knew exactly which one was where. Basket number 17 was no coincidence. She felt that slight tug on the back of her neck that she knew when a case began to branch out, when a dead man became questions, and questions became abysses. Ralph Bender had not been a man who simply disappeared without leaving a trace. He had made decisions, upset people, favored others, and somewhere in between. There must have been someone who had decided that enough was enough. We need to deal with the landlords, Jensen said. All of them. Peterson raised his eyebrows. Everyone. Everyone, she repeated. Anyone who had access here knew how to move a beach chair without attracting attention. Anyone who worked here knew when no one was looking. She looked at the dead man again. The blanket moved slightly in the wind, rising and falling, as if the body were breathing beneath it, a perfunctory, almost comforting sight. The morning after, Jensen thought. For some, it began like any other. For Ralph Bender, it had been the last, and for them, it was the beginning of a case that would not end on the beach. The wind carried the screeching of the seagulls across the water. The beach was silent, and basket number 17 stood crookedly in the sand, as if refusing to conform to this order. Wonder was popular, at least on the posters. Neely Jensen looked at one of them, which was hanging crookedly on a beach pillar near the promenade. The wind had loosened a corner. It tapped softly against the damp paper. Ralph Bender smiled down from there, that routine, rehearsed smile that suggests closeness and, at the same time, distance. For our coast, for the future, was written underneath. The colors had faded, the blue had turned to gray, the white dirty. A face from another time, or from a reality that had never existed. The files revealed a different picture. Jensen sat in the small conference room of the provisionally set up investigation office, a cup of coffee in her hand that had long since gone cold. In front of her lay a stack of papers, neatly sorted, marked with colored markers. Minutes of the building committee, land register extracts, bank statements. A life in documents reduced to numbers, signatures, and marginal notes. She had learned that the truth often began where no one was looking anymore. Real estate transactions, she said quietly, turning the page. 3 years ago, an area near the dunes, officially unsellable due to nature conservation regulations. 2 months later, it was canceled. The buyer was a newly founded project company. The managing director was an old acquaintance of Bender's. Tom Peterson stood at the window, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. He looked out at the gray morning as if he could see something out there that was hidden in the files. And 6 months later, quote, actually without turning around, a sum appeared in Bender's account that a local politician with his salary would have a hard time explaining. Jensen nodded. Sudden prosperity was rarely a coincidence. New kitchen, new car, a vacation home, officially registered in the wife's name. Everything was clean. Everything plausible enough not to immediately provoke questions. And yet something dark was creeping forward between the lines, a pattern of favors and dependencies. Opaque permits, said Jensen. Building applications that would otherwise take months went through him as if by magic. Always the same companies, always the same names. Peterson turned around. His face was tired, his eyes red. He had enemies, he said dryly. Jensen looked at him, or at debtors. The word hung in the air for a moment. Debtors, people who had to pay something back without it being recorded anywhere. People who knew that favors had an expiration date. She opened another file. Citizen complaints, handwritten letters, emails with subject lines in all caps. Betrayal, corruption, selling out our coastline. Most had been filed away, answered with standard phrases or not at all. Jensen had seen many times how easily outrage could fade into background noise when it was too loud. He was still popular, Peterson said, to the right people. Popular enough to get elected, Jensen replied. Not popular enough to be untouchable. She closed the file. The sound was final, as if she were closing a chapter, even though she knew it had only just begun. Ralph Bender had many faces. The one on the posters, the one in the boardrooms, and the one that showed up only in columns of numbers and signed permits. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Shortly afterwards, the beach chair rental company entered. A man in his mid-50s, his face weather-beaten, his shoulders slightly hunched forward as if you're constantly working against the wind. He smelled of stale smoke and coffee. His hands were rough, his fingernails clean, but deeply torn. Sit down, Jensen said, pointing to the chair opposite him. He did so slowly, carefully, as if he might do something wrong if he moved too quickly. His gaze wandered briefly to Peterson, then back to Jensen. He cleared his throat. You found the dead man, Jensen said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. Yes. Tell me again what happened. The man opened his mouth, closed it again. He looked at his hands, clasped them together, unclasped them again. Seconds passed. Too many seconds. Jensen said nothing. She knew that silence was a tool, sometimes the most powerful. I do my rounds in the morning, he finally began. Always the same way. I'll check the baskets to see if everything is okay, if anyone has damaged anything. And then, Peterson asked. The landlord hesitated. His gaze flickered to the door as if he expected someone to come in. Then I saw him in the basket. At first I thought someone had spent the night there. It happens sometimes. And what made you suspicious? Jensen asked. That silence again. Noticeably long. Too long for a man who had nothing to hide. Jensen watched as his jaw worked, observing how a muscle tensed right along the side of his temple. The shoes, he finally said. Nobody puts their shoes out like that. Not just like that. Jensen nodded slowly. Did you know Ralph Bender? The man raised his head. Everyone knew Bender. Personally? A brief hesitation. They had dealings with each other. In what way? He took a deep breath. He was here often, took care of various matters, handled permits and official regulations. To their advantage? Peterson asked. The man shrugged. Sometimes, and sometimes not, Jensen asked. He looked at her, finally looking straight at her. There was something in his eyes that she recognized. Fear, and something else. Annoyance, maybe even rage. He wasn't always fair, the landlord said quietly. Did he have enemies? Peterson asked. The man laughed briefly, without any mirth. If you ask anyone who works here, they'll all tell you yes. Debtors, Jensen? The laughter died down. The man looked down. That silence again. This time heavier, denser. I don't know, he said finally. All I know is that he's taken on a lot of people, and that he thought he could get away with it. Jensen leaned back. She studied him for a moment, recording every movement of hesitation. A man who knew more than he was saying. One of many, she guessed. You are to remain reachable, she stated firmly. We will speak again. He nodded in a hurt fashion, stood up, and exited the room without glancing back even once. Jensen watched him depart, then reached for the files once more. Ralph Bender was dead, but his stories lived on within the documents, in memories, and in the persistent silence of those who required too much time to respond. A man possessing many faces had left behind many traces, and not all of them could be erased as easily as simple footprints in the sand. The beach was divided into specific zones, even if one barely noticed this as an outsider. For the vacationers, they were merely rows of beach chairs, neatly aligned and numbered, sometimes situated closer to the water, sometimes further up in the sand. For Neely Jensen, however, a different picture began to form over it all that morning. One that had far less to do with mere recreation than with ownership, influence, and control. 3 landlords shared the beach. Officially, they were competitors. 3 small firms, 3 family names, and 3 signs standing along the promenade. Each had his section, his baskets, his prices. If you look closely, you could see differences. Here, there's freshly painted wood. There, worn-out armrests. Here, new upholstery. Over there, those that have been repaired. But beneath this surface, something else was going on. Something agreed upon. Jensen walked slowly along the beach, accompanied by Peterson. The wind had picked up, driving fine sand across her shoes and making the stalks of the dune grass rustle in the breeze. She stopped, looked over the uniform rows, as if trying to discern a pattern that I didn't want to impose. It's like a chessboard, she said quietly. Everyone knows which fields belong to them, and which ones they'd better not tread on. Peterson nodded. Prices are remarkably similar, hardly fluctuate at all, regardless of whether it's peak season or lull. Agreements, Jensen said. Or a cartel. Unofficially, of course. No one wrote anything like that, though. No one talked about it openly. But everyone knew about it. Prices, payments, hush money. Anyone who wanted to join needed more than capital. They needed approval. And anyone who didn't get it was left or went under. They had the documents adopted. Complaints from smaller providers who had tried and failed. Applications that were suddenly delayed. Permits that were never granted because some requirement had not been met. Jensen had seen these mechanisms elsewhere. Power rarely showed itself openly. It seemed quiet, countable. And then Bender came along, said Peterson. Jensen nodded. Ralph Bender had intervened. At first we seemed harmless. New regulations, they said. Standardization, transparency, order. Words that sounded good and were easy to sell. Yet every new rule had an effect, and every single effect had its own beneficiary. New fees for beach use, new requirements for distances, new requirements for maintenance, all officially in the name of safety and quality, unofficially an instrument to exert pressure. Those who paid remained in the game. Those who resisted lost ground. And suddenly there were new beneficiaries, said Jensen, coincidentally always the same ones. Peterson pulled a file out of his pocket. One of the landlords had increased his area, officially through a new allocation, unofficially through a decision by the building committee. Bender, Jensen said. Bender, confirmed Peterson. They walked on, stopped in front of a row of particularly well-kept beach chairs. The wood gleamed despite the gray day. The cushions looked barely used. Success, Jensen thought, often looked like that. Quiet, inconspicuous, natural. He wanted to exert pressure on someone, she finally stated. Peterson looked at her, or was being blackmailed himself. The thought hung heavy and unpleasant between them. Jensen let it sink in. It fit the picture that was slowly forming. Wenders, the puppet master, was the simple version, Bender, as the driven man, the more dangerous one. She remembered the beach chair, the staging of the scene, and the way the dead man had sat there as if he were being put on display for everyone to see. A warning, but for whom? When you are part of a cartel, Jensen said, then loyalty is everything, and betrayal is either deadly or expensive, added Peterson. They resolved to speak with the three landlords individually, not together, and certainly not in the same order as they had originally planned. Jensen knew that sometimes it was enough to create small differences in the process to make cracks visible. The first man greeted them in his office behind the promenade. It smelled of wood preservative and cold coffee. He was friendly, almost too friendly, talked a lot, said little. Everything had gone smoothly, all decisions transparent. Bands, a reliable contact person. Jensen listened, asked questions, noted contradictions. Small, barely noticeable one. The second landlord was quieter. His answers were brief, almost reluctant. He spoke about the competition, about difficult times, and about unfair accusations. As Jensen asked about the bands, his eyes narrowed for a brief moment in time. Just one? That was enough. The third one kept them waiting for a long time, on purpose. Jensen suspected. When they finally sat down, he folded his arms across his chest, as if he had to protect or defend himself. We are entrepreneurs, he said, not criminals. Nobody said that either, Jensen replied calmly. Then I don't understand why you're here. She looked at him. A man is dead. A shadow passed over his face, which was quickly suppressed by someone. This is tragic. Tragic is an accident, Jensen said. This is something else. He fell silent. Peterson took a step closer. The silence stretched. Jensen felt something shift. Not enough for confession, but enough for uncertainty. The wind had picked up outside. The beach seemed colder, more forbidding. Jensen thought of the many summers spent here, of vacations, of children, of ease, and how little of it remained when you looked behind the scenes. Bonds had power, Peterson said, as they walked back to the car later. And power breeds dependency. And dependency breeds fear, Jensen said. He stopped, looked out over the beach once more. 3 landlords, 3 interests, a car that remained invisible to the outside world, but had clear rules on the inside. And a man who had changed those rules, whether out of greed, out of arrogance, or because someone else had pulled at him. The beach remained silent. But Jensen knew that somewhere beneath the sand lay answers, and the deeper they dug, the more likely it became that someone would try to stop them. The news reached Neely Jensen in the early afternoon as the beach slowly filled up and life cautiously returned to where it had been quiet that morning. Children's voices mingled with the sound of the waves. Somewhere, dishes clinked from a cafe on the promenade. It was this strange simultaneity, thought Jensen, that characterized the way in which the world reacted to these specific crimes. She held her breath for a moment and then continued. The forensic pathologist was already waiting in the small examination room of the clinic. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and cold metal, a smell that Jensen was familiar with and yet never liked. The woman was standing over the paperwork, her hair tied back tightly, her glasses pushed down low on her nose. She looked up as Jensen entered and nodded curtly. Your feeling was right, she said without further ado. Death from blunt force trauma. Jensen sat down, clasped her hands in her lap. She had expected this answer, and yet there was this slight twinge in her stomach that always came when a suspicion became certainty. Head. Back of the head, the medical examiner confirmed. A targeted blow, no defensive injuries. He must have been taken by surprise. On the beach? Jensen asked, although she already knew the answer. The medical examiner shook her head. No, not on the beach. Everything's been. No sand in the wounds, no marks that would match. Death occurred somewhere else. Jensen leaned back. The image of the beach chair appeared in her mind's eye. The blanket, the shoes, this peculiar calm that had settled over everything like a carefully ironed cloth. The beach chair is staged, not a crime scene, the medical examiner said calmly. The sentence lingered in the room. Staged. Jensen thought of staging, of lighting, of perspective, of someone who didn't just want to kill but to show, who had been willing to go to great lengths to tell a story. Time of death, she asked. Between 5 and 6 in the morning, the doctor replied. Approximately. There were no signs of alcohol or drugs. He was conscious. Jensen closed his eyes briefly. Consciousness meant fear, or anger, or both. And then, after that, the body was moved. The doctor said, carefully. There was no evidence of rough handling, no additional injuries. Someone had time. Time was a luxury, especially at night, especially in a place that was busy in the morning. Someone had brought tapes here, carefully, with time, and with a message. When Jensen left the hospital, the sky had cleared. The sun was low, bathing everything in a deceptively warm light. She drove back to the beach, left the car at the edge, and walked a short distance. The barriers had been removed. Only a few police officers were still standing, scattered about, looking out of place among beach bags and people walking. Tom Peterson came towards her. Forensic medicine. Blunt force trauma, Jensen said. Didn't happen here. Peterson exhaled slowly. So it was staged. Yes, Jensen said, and not spontaneous. They walked side by side, stopped in front of basket number 17. It was empty now, seemed harmless, almost lost among the others. Jensen looked at it for a long time. The spot in the sand, where the shoes had been, was blurred. Tracks disappeared quickly when enough people walked over it. Someone wanted him to be found here, Peterson said, not just anywhere. Right here. Yes, Jensen replied. And not just anywhere, but like this. She crouched down and slowly ran her hand over the wicker weave of the beach chair. The material was rough, resistant. Not a place where you could easily place someone if you were in a hurry. Someone had made an effort, had made sure that everything was... What's the message? Peterson asked. Jensen straightened up. That depends on who's supposed to read it. She thought of the beachhead tenants, of cartel, of Bender's role in it. Maybe it had been a warning or a reckoning. Maybe someone had wanted to show what happened to them. They thought they were in charge of the rules. A politician in a beach chair, Peterson said thoughtfully. That's pretty clear. A man who made decisions about this beach, Jensen said. About fees, allocations, permits. And now he's sitting here, silenced. Peterson twisted his mouth. You think that's directed at the others or at everyone? Jensen said. Sometimes it takes one death to silence many. They walked on, leaving the beach chair behind them. Jensen felt that familiar weight upon his shoulders, which always seemed to emerge whenever a case started to take on real depth. It wasn't just about one dead person anymore. It was about structures, about power, about people who thought they could stay in the background. In the evening, Jensen sat alone in the office, the documents spread out in front of him. Photos of the crime scene, reports, statements. Everything seemed orderly, and yet she knew that this order was deceptive. Feigned calm, she thought, like the beach chair, like the picture of a peaceful morning. She picked up a photo in which Ralph Bender could be seen in the beach chair. The perspective was slightly elevated, the angle chosen so that everything was visible. Jensen imagined someone standing behind the camera. Calm, focused, perhaps even content. You wanted to say something, she murmured, but dead people didn't talk. They only left traces for others to read. Jensen knew that the message hadn't been meant for her. It was background noise. The real addressees were sitting somewhere else, blowing between the lines, calculating, keeping quiet. She put the photo back and reached for her notebook. She wrote a word on the first page, stage, second below it, time, and below that, message. The case had begun to unravel, and Jensen was certain that with each answer, new questions would arise. The calm that the beach radiated was a lie, a carefully constructed surface. Beneath it, something lurked that wouldn't rest. The beach was now back to what it always had been, a place where people sought out their own stories. Walkers stopped and looked out to sea, not knowing what had happened a few hours earlier. Children built castles that the next tide would sweep away. Life continued to right itself, indifferent and unwavering. Only those who knew exactly looked at it recognized the places where something was no longer right. Neely Jensen knelt in the sand. The wind had picked up, blowing fine grains across the surface and blurring contours as if to help. Jensen was familiar with this interplay of time and nature. Traces were fleeting. They lived on attention and on someone looking at them in time. The shoe print began right next to the beach chair, the right foot planted firmly, the heel deeply pressed in. The sole had a distinctive profile, wide grooves with small triangles in between. Jensen leaned closer without touching the print. She held her breath as if even he could change something. The print led away from the beach chair. A few steps straight ahead, then it disappeared. Half blurred, deliberately destroyed. Jensen straightened up a bit, let his gaze follow the invisible path. After a few meters, nothing more could be seen. No further print, no stumble, no hesitation. Only smooth sand, as if someone had deliberately moved to the side or as if someone had helped. Someone wanted to be seen, she murmured. Tom Peterson stood behind her, his hands in his pockets, his eyes also fixed on the sand. Or someone wanted us to believe he wanted to be seen. Jensen nodded almost imperceptibly. She liked this second level, these doubts that run like fine cracks through seemingly clear images. She had learned that nothing was as dangerous as a trace that seemed too obvious. She pulled a small ruler from her pocket and roughly measured the print. Size 12, perhaps male. Probably nothing unusual. Not matching anything. or too much. Addie. When someone wants to disappear inconspicuously, Peterson said, they leave no trace. When someone wants us to follow them, Jensen replied, they leave one, and make sure it ends at the right moment. She brushed a strand of hair out of her face. The sand clung to her knees, damp and cool. She thought of the night, of darkness, of silence, of someone who had stood here, perhaps hesitating for a moment. Maybe not. Someone who had had time to think about how much they wanted to show, or someone who knew exactly how investigators were thinking. Deliberately destroyed, Jensen said again. Do you use this? The print doesn't just break off. It gets smudged. Peterson crouched down, leaned closer. With her other foot, or with her hand, or with an object. Jensen slowly straightened up. This isn't rushing, this is controlling her. She looked out across the beach, taking in the rows of beach chairs. Everything seemed the same, and yet there was something different here. A place where someone had made a decision. Not just a deadly one, but a narrative one as well. Maybe it's not the killer's print after all, Peterson said. Bad. Maybe it's the print we're supposed to see. Jensen looked at him. Or a wrong path. Or a diversionary tactic. They were silent for a while. The sea roared evenly, as if it had no part in everything. Jensen felt that familiar feeling spreading through her. The knowledge that she was standing at a point where everything could branch out. Every interpretation opened up a new direction, and each could be wrong. Who benefits from this? She asked. Fine. Peterson frowned. From the fact that we believe in a perpetrator or in someone who is fleeing. Or that we believe in movement, Jensen said in a way. Away from the beach. Away from the basket. She thought of the medical examiner, the blow on the transport of the body, the care. Nothing about it had looked like escape, nothing like panic. This is after the fact, Jensen said. The print is part of the staging, like the shoes, like the blanket. Peterson nodded slowly. So no real trail. Yes, there is, Jensen said, but not one that leads us anywhere, but one that should keep us busy. She looked down at the sand again. The print was barely visible now. A gust of wind was enough to dissolve it further. Soon it would be gone, and with it, the possibility of reading it differently. Or someone wanted us to believe in something specific, Jensen muttered. Peterson looked at her. What? Jensen turned his gaze back to the sea. At a perpetrator from outside. At someone who comes and goes. Not at someone who stays. She stood up, brushed the sand off her pants, her knees aching slightly, a physical echo of what was moving her inside. She didn't like false trails. They were like lies that came across as friendly. When you're part of a system, Peterson said slowly, then it's wise to direct suspicion from the inside out. Yes, said Jensen. And if you don't want anyone to look closely, you give them something to look at. They walked back in the direction of the promenade. Jensen cast one final glance at that specific spot in the sand. It would soon disappear, yet the thought behind it remained. Later, while sitting in her office, Jensen examined the photos of the tracks. She enlarged various sections and adjusted the contrasts. She attempted to read the impression just as one would read a text. Where did it begin? Where did it end? And why exactly there? She wrote into her notebook that track as a statement, not as a path. Below that, she added, who is speaking here? The case began to gain depth, not through what was clearly visible, but through what had been deliberately distorted. Jensen knew that she could not rely upon what was presented to her. The perpetrator, or perhaps the perpetrators, had thought ahead, had planned ahead, had calculated precisely how investigators would react, and that was exactly what made him so dangerous. Outside, the evening was falling over the beach. The tide was coming back in, slowly, inexorably. It would smooth out the sand, remove all traces, and restore the beach to a state of apparent untouchedness. Forced calm, Jensen thought. That word again, just like the beach chair, like the print, like a promise that only lasted until you took a closer look. The cafe was located directly on the promenade, a wide glass front facing the sea, as if you had to look outside to be able to endure what was being said inside. It was early afternoon. The table was only half full. The smell of freshly ground coffee mingled with sweet pastries and the salty breeze that the wind carried in through the open door. A place that promised comfort without really At the time when the widow sat upright at a small table near the window, she had her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles were standing up bone white. She was wearing a dark coat, even though it was actually too warm for it, as if she had to protect herself. Her gaze was directed forward, not at the sea, not at Jensen and Peterson, but at a point somewhere in between. No tears, only anger. Neely Jensen sat down opposite her, put the folder with the documents on the chair next to her. She waited a moment, said nothing. She knew that this moment was important, that words when... Thank you for coming, Jensen said finally. The widow nodded curtly. I didn't want to sit at home. I see, Jensen replied. She did understand. Some places became unbearable when a person disappeared from them. A waitress came, put coffee on the table, didn't ask any questions. Jensen took the mug, warmed his hands on it without drinking. Peterson sat a little way off, leaving the room to Jensen. He watched the guests, the conversations, the normalcy. You identified your husband this morning, Jensen? Said calmly. Yes. The widow's voice was firm, almost hard. It was obvious. Jensen nodded. Would you like to tell me something about him? A brief, bitter smile crossed the woman's face. What exactly? How he's been lately? The widow exhaled slowly. Her shoulders slumped just a fraction. He's been tense, she said. For weeks, maybe longer. Why? He didn't tell me that. A brief hesitation. Not everything. Jensen let his gaze rest on her hands. Her fingers moved slightly, as if they were turning something invisible. A ring, not the wedding ring, was missing. Her husband was a public figure, Jensen said. He had a lot of responsibility. He had a lot of power, the widow corrected. And he used it. Jensen looked up. What do you mean? The woman looked up directly for the first time. Her eyes were clear, alert, without the milky haze that grief sometimes brought. My husband was not a good man, she said, but he knew too much. The sentence hung between them like a foreign object. Peterson glanced over briefly. Jensen didn't show any reaction. About whom? He asked. The widow remained silent. It was not an embarrassed silence, nor an uncertain one. It was a deliberate silence, a calculated choice that clearly defined where a boundary was drawn. Jensen recognized it immediately. That same silence again. Just like with the landlords. Like with all those individuals who instinctively suspected that their words carried heavy consequences. Mrs. Bender, Jensen said quietly, your husband is dead. If there are people who wanted to cause him harm, there are many of them, she interrupted. You know that yourself. And there are also people who could potentially profit from it, Jensen continued. The more information we have, the better we can understand what actually occurred. The widow leaned back slowly. The chair creaked under her weight. She gazed out the window, at the sea, which lay there peacefully today, as if it had witnessed nothing and heard nothing. He got involved with the wrong people, she said finally. Or he was one of them himself. I don't know what the difference was. Was he afraid? Jensen asked. The widow hesitated for a moment. Then she nodded. Yes. But from what? From the fear that everything might be exposed, she said with a brief smile. That was both hard and tired. And from the fear that someone might be faster than him. Jensen felt something coming together inside her. Fear, agitation, pressure. It all fit into the picture that was slowly taking shape in his mind. Did he receive any direct threats? Not openly, the widow replied. There were no letters, no phone calls that I would have noticed. But there were conversations and secret meetings. He came home late, and sometimes he did not come home at all. With whom did he meet? Jensen asked. That silence returned once. The widow closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them once more, there was something new reflecting within them. Tiredness. Perhaps also a sense of relief. If I say this, she began slowly, then I might be bringing myself into a difficult situation. We are able to offer you protection, Jensen stated. The woman laughed softly to herself. That is what you all say, but you know just as well as I do that it is not always enough. Jensen remained silent. She knew that it was the truth. He once told me, the widow continued, that it is better to remain calm. Here on the coast of the sea sees everything that happens, but never passes anything on. She shook her head slowly. He considered that to be a sign of wisdom. And you? Jensen asked. I considered it to be cowardice. A sudden gust of wind pressed hard against the window pane, causing it to vibrate briefly. Jensen thought of the beach chair, of the stage, and of the message. Perhaps it had been intended for this woman as well. Do you believe that the death of your husband was meant as a warning? Jensen asked. The widow looked at her for a long time. Yes, she said finally, but it was not meant for me. For whom, then? The woman lowered her gaze. For those who now hope that everything will continue as before. Jensen made a mental note. An argument, a decision. There were new regulations, the widow said. New fees, new winners. She looked at Jensen again. He told me that he had to pressure someone, that there was no other option. And who pressured him? Jensen asked. The silence was immediately heavy, final. The widow reached for her cup, took a sip, as if she needed this small movement to collect herself. I can't tell you any names, she said. Not now. Why not? Because I'm still here, she replied simply. Jensen nodded slowly. She understood. Sometimes silence wasn't a refusal, but a survival strategy. If you think of anything, Jensen said, or if anything changes, I'll let you know, the widow interrupted. Maybe. She stood up, pulled her morning tighter around her, even though it was warm in the cafe. For a moment, she looked as if she wanted something else. Then she shook her head almost imperceptibly. He wasn't a good person, she repeated quietly. But he wasn't stupid either. If he's dead, it's because someone wanted him to be. She left Jensen and Peterson behind and walked out into the wind, which blew her coat around her legs. Jensen watched her go. She sensed that familiar feeling that lay more behind the silence than behind many confessions. You should know something, Peterson said, when the door had closed behind the widow. Yes, Jensen replied, and she's afraid. She finally took a sip of coffee. It was bitter and cold, like the truth that was slowly revealing itself. It wasn't the first time the name came up, but this time it stuck with Neela Jensen. It was written on the edge of a file, noted almost casually, as if no one wanted to take him too seriously. A former beach chair rental company who had left the company a good 5 years ago, officially because of financial difficulties, unofficially because of a decision by the building committee that had deprived him of his foundation. Jensen was familiar with such phrases. They reeked of clean words for dirty procedures. She was sitting alone in the office. Dusk was already falling over the promenade. The light outside had become soft. Inside, the neon light above her desk flickered. Jensen leafed through the files slowly, taking her time. Old scores, she thought. They were rarely forgotten, only repressed. The man had, in earlier times, been responsible for managing a small section of the beach. No big company, no network of contacts. A lone fighter, the documents described him as. Someone who repaired his own beach chairs, who was the first to arrive in the morning and the last to leave in the evening. Then came the new regulations, new distances, new fees, new requirements that he could not or was not allowed to meet. Ruined, Jensen muttered, gazing down at the figures. Revenues had plummeted, loans had defaulted, and ultimately everything was sold below its actual value. Just then, Tom Peterson entered the room, holding 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He set one of them down in front of Jensen, and then sat down directly across from her. I suppose you found it too. Jensen nodded. He fits the profile far too well. Peterson's mouth twisted in distaste. Previous convictions. Assault, 1 count of serious property damage. He was clearly never one to be squeamish. He was prone to violence, Jensen noted. That is what it says here. She turned another page of the file. There were police reports, old and yellowed, detailing bar fights and an argument with a rival. It was said that he once broke a man's nose, claimed self-defense, and the case subsequently dropped. Jensen was familiar with these types of texts. They never managed to tell the whole story. He hated tapes, Peterson said. He blamed him for absolutely everything. That would certainly make him the perfect perpetrator, Jensen replied. Peterson looked at her intently. You do not believe in the perfect perpetrator. I do not believe in mere coincidences, Jensen said, and I certainly do not believe in solutions that present themselves far too quickly for comfort. She leaned back, closed her eyes briefly. Too obvious. A man with a motive, a history, a propensity for violence. Someone who had nothing left to lose. That was the kind of story that people really like to tell. It was simple, understandable, conclusive, too simple. When was the last time anyone saw him? Jensen asked. Peterson flipped through his notes. At a bar outside of town last night, he drank heavily and complained loudly about some tapes. Did anyone see him after that? Jensen asked. No, Peterson said, but that doesn't mean much. Jensen nodded slowly. And that is precisely the problem. She stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, lights were reflecting off the wet asphalt. The coast appeared peaceful, almost sleepy. She thought of the beach chair, of the staging, and of the time someone had had to prepare it all. This man is full of rage, she stated. He is impulsive. If he had killed Bander, he would not have done it this way. Not with a blanket and shoes? Peterson asked. Not with such calm, Jensen replied. Not with a message. Peterson was silent. He knew that she was right. People prone to violence could plan, yes, but this specific type of planning had something cold about it, something deliberate and carefully measured in the way it was executed. Jensen had seen too many crime scenes to be fooled by that. Still, we have to check him out, Peterson said. Of course, Jensen said. Thoroughly. That's exactly why. The next morning, they drove to the man's house. He was now living on the outskirts of town in a small apartment, workshop. The plaster was crumbling. The doorbell didn't work properly. Peterson knocked for a long time. Finally, the man opened the door. Broad shoulders, gray hair, unkempt beard, eyes watchful, suspicious. What do you want? He asked. Detective police, Jensen said, holding out his ID. We have a few questions. You let them in. The apartment smelled of oil and stale smoke. Old photos of the beach hung on the walls. Rows of beach chairs neatly arranged. Another time. I know why you're here, he said, without her having said anything. Because of tapes? Jensen watched him closely. His hands trembled slightly as he sat down. Or was it anger? Or alcohol? Where were you last night? Peterson asked. Here, the man said. Alone. Can anyone confirm that? Jensen asked. He laughed briefly. Who cares? Jensen said calmly. He looked at her, then shook his head. No, Jensen nodded. She looked around the room. No disorder, no signs of haste. Everything seemed frozen time, as if absolutely nothing here had changed for many years. You hated tapes, Peterson said. The man raised his head. His eyes sparkled. Yes. Why? Jensen asked. Because he took everything from me, he said. Because he decided that I have no business left being here any longer. Did you tell him that? Jensen asked. Everyone told him that, the man replied. He just didn't listen. Jensen could feel the anger burning inside him. Unfeigned. But she also felt something else. Resignation. Weariness. Did you threaten him? She asked. I told him he would pay for it, the man said. Eventually, Peterson leaned forward. And did he? The man laughed bitterly. Not because of me. Jensen held his gaze. She searched for cracks, for uncertainties, for anything that didn't fit. But she found nothing that indicated this act, not this kind of death. If they had killed him, she said, slowly, would you want it to be seen? The man looked at her, irritated. What do you mean? The beach chair, the staging. He shook his head. If I had killed him, I would have left him where he fell. Jensen nodded. That was exactly what she had expected. When they were back in the car later, Peterson said, Ed, it's not him. No, Jensen said, but he will be useful to us. How so? Peterson asked. He shows us how false the image that is being presented to us is, Jensen said, and who benefits from it. She looked out onto the street. Old scores were rarely settled, but they were often used as a distraction, as an excuse. Jensen did not like easy answers. They were rarely true. Because the office was located in the back of the city hall, far away from the corridors close to the public, where citizens submitted their applications and hoped for decisions. A room without charm, almost sober in its business, just as Rolf Bender had appeared to the outside world. Nile Jensen stood at the doorway for a moment and let her gaze wander. The desk was tidy, too tidy for a man who had supposedly been under pressure. No open documents, no hastily left notes. Order could calm or conceal. He knew what he was doing, Tom Peterson said quietly behind her. Jensen nodded. She stepped in, pulled on gloves, and began to open drawer after drawer. Paper clips, stamps, old business cards. Nothing that couldn't be explained. A life that dissolved into administrative routine. The USB stick lay in the bottom drawer, hidden under a pile of empty folders. Small, black, inconspicuous. No label. Jensen held it between two fingers, as if it were something fragile. That's it, she said. Peterson leaned forward. Just like that? Nothing is simple, Jensen replied, but some things are deliberately inconspicuous. Back in the office, they slid the stick into the computer. The screen remained blank for a moment, then a folder opened. No pictures, no private files, just documents, meeting minutes, building committee, dates listed soberly. Jensen felt that faint, tingling sensation she knew when something opened that had been locked for a long time. That looks official, Peterson said. At first glance, Jensen replied. She opened the first document. Minutes of a meeting, seemingly routine. Agenda items, voting results, signatures. But on second reading, she noticed small shifts, wording that didn't fit, paragraphs that had been added later. Jensen highlighted passages, compared versions. The metadata told a different story. Changes after the meeting. Manipulated. Several times, she said quietly. Peterson leaned back. Approvals in exchange for favors. Jensen nodded. It had been a quiet business. No open bribes, no envelopes. Just decisions that suddenly turned out differently than announced. Construction projects that were approved even though they had previously been rejected. Requirements that disappeared. Fees that were adjusted. Always with a clear justification. Always within the bounds of possibility. She clicked on. A table opened. Names, dates, links. Jensen paused briefly. She knew this structure. Who had given whom an advantage and when. Who had profited from it and who had... There you are, said Peterson. The names of the beach chair rental companies also appeared. Not all of them, but enough to recognize a pattern. Allocations of beach sections, extensions of contracts, special permits, all meticulously documented, but inside had never officially existed. He kept records, Peterson said. Yes, Jensen said, and not out of nostalgia. She thought of the widow, of her words. He knew too much. Maybe Bender had come to understand at some point that knowledge was power, or protection, or both. Maybe he had started to protect himself against those who pressured him, or against those he himself was pressuring. Jensen opened another document, a log that was quite different from the others. More changes, more notes, and a list at the end. Abbreviations, initials, sums, not spelled out, but clearly read as advantages. Someone wanted this knowledge to disappear, or never be found. Or someone killed him before he could use it, Peterson added. She saved everything twice, backed up the data. The USB stick suddenly seemed heavier, as if it had gained weight. Jensen knew that she had something now in her hand, which was bigger than a single murder. It was about structures, about years of agreements, about a net that had been spread across the beach like an invisible grid. When this becomes public, Peterson said, some fall very softly, and others very deep. Jensen replied, She looked over the names again. The beach chair rental companies, the building committee, connections that could no longer be denied. Suddenly, the murder took on a different color. More strategic. Bender was not a victim in the classic sense, Peterson said. No, Jensen said. But he was not a lone perpetrator either. She leaned back, rubbed her eyes, tiredness spreading, but underneath it all lay the alert tension she needed. The case had reached a new level. A dead man had become a system, and systems fought back. We have to be careful, Peterson said. Yes, Jensen replied, but we can't go back now. She took the USB stick and put it in a labeled evidence bag, a small piece of plastic that contained more truth than many would have liked. She thought of the beach, of the baskets, of the apparent order. The secret protocol had been found, and with it the certainty that Ralph Bender had not only died because he had enemies, but because he had begun to become aware of his own role. The promenade was in semi-darkness when Neela Jensen parked the car. The lights of the cafes were off. Only a few street lamps cast yellow circles on the asphalt. The sea was barely audible. A dark, steady breathing in the background. Nighttime conversations had their own quality, Jensen knew. People said things that they kept to themselves during the day, not because they were more honest, but because tiredness had made the protective layers thinner. The landlord had asked them to come after closing time, not to the office, not to the beach, but to a small warehouse behind the promenade where spare cushions, tools, and old beach chairs stood there that no one needed anymore. The smell of wood, dust, and damp fabric hung in the air. A bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a pale glow over everything. The man was already waiting. He had his hands in his pockets and was standing slightly crooked as if he didn't feel quite right about the floor. He was one of those who had worked here for years, inconspicuous, reliable, mad. Someone who knew when to keep quiet. They wanted to talk, Jensen said, stopping. He nodded. It's quieter now. It often is at night, she replied. She let her gaze wander around the hall. Old beach chairs were stacked on top of each other, some broken, others simply outdated. Jensen thought of order and how quickly it fell apart when no one was looking. You knew tapes well, she began. The man twisted his mouth. As well as one could possibly know him. What does that mean? He took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. He wanted, he finally said. More and more. Jensen was silent. She knew that this sentence needed the space. At first, it was manageable, the man continued. A fee here, a special rule there. You played along. Because everyone played along. Then Jensen asked them and got tighter, he said, more expensive, more personal. He looked at her, as if checking if she understood. Jensen nodded slightly. She understood very well. He kept lists, the man said. Not officially, but he knew exactly who owed him something. Jensen thought of the USB stick, of names, of dates, and she shrugged. I wanted peace and quiet. The sentence sounded simple, almost banal. Jensen knew that was precisely where his truth lay. Peace and quiet rarely comes cheap, she said. He laughed briefly. No, but she is predictable. Jensen leaned against an old beach chair. The wickerwork creaked softly. What happened? The man looked at the door, then back at her. He threatened. With what? By making things public. Decisions, agreements. He swallowed. Not just mine. And they didn't give in? Jensen asked. I paid, he said, for a while. But eventually I stopped. He nodded. At some point, enough. Jensen watched him closely. There was no haste in his movements, no restlessness, just exhaustion. The kind of weariness that didn't come from a sleepless night, but from years of always having to think one step ahead. Were you here the night he died? She asked. Yes, he said. I did the accounting. Until late. Can anyone confirm that? My wife, he replied, and the surveillance camera. Jensen nodded. She would have it checked out, but she didn't believe him. But because he seemed convincing, but because he didn't seem like he wanted to prove anything. Did you threaten him? She asked. The man looked at her for a long time. No? Did you wish for him to disappear? He hesitated. Then he said quietly, yes. The wind pressed against the hall, causing the metal to vibrate slightly. Jensen let the answer sink in. Wishes were not actions, but they were a start. Sometimes that's enough motive, she said. The man nodded slowly. I know. She was looking at him. But sometimes is not enough for murder. He exhaled audibly. I didn't kill him. I'm not saying that either, Jensen replied. I'm just saying that you're not the only one who wanted peace. A shadow passed over his face. There are others, he said. Names? Jensen asked. He shook his head. Not from me. Then why are you talking to me? She asked. He looked down at the floor. Because I don't want this to continue. Jensen felt that soft click in her head when something shifted. Maybe it wasn't a confession, but it was a step. Thunder thought he was untouchable, the man said. He thought he had everyone in his hands. And now? Jensen asked. Now he's dead, the man said. And no one knows what's coming next. Jensen straightened up. Yes, she said calmly. We know that. She went to the door, stopped again. If you remember, if you think of anything, even small things. He nodded. I'll let you know. Outside, the night had thickened. Jensen walked to the car, feeling the cold in her fingers. Calm, she thought. A small word. A big motive. For many, it was enough to shift boundaries. For some, to cross them once and for all. She started the engine and drove off. The sea remained behind, black and silent. But Jensen knew that this night would not remain quiet. The confession came early in the morning, when the sky still hung undecided between night and day. Neela Jensen was already in the office. She had half forgotten about her first coffee, standing next to her when Tom Peterson came in. He looked tense, but also relieved, the way people look when they think they finally have something solid in their hands. He admitted it, Peterson said bluntly. Jensen looked at him. She said nothing. Confessions had their own smell to her. Some smelled of truth, others of desperation. The ex-landlord, Peterson continued. He claims he killed Bant out of rage, because of everything he had lost. Jensen leaned back. An hour ago, after the third interrogation, he was exhausted. Of course he was tired, Jensen thought. Exhaustion was a powerful ally. She stood up. I want to see him. The interrogation room was cool and functional. The man sat slumped in his chair, his hands resting on the table, as if they had forgotten what they were otherwise meant to be doing. His gaze was vacanter than before. Jensen sat down across from him, letting a moment pass. You confessed, she said calmly. He nodded. Yes, why not? She asked. He shrugged his shoulders. Because it does not interest anyone what I have to say anyway. Jensen looked at him. That's not true. He laughed briefly. Now you have your perpetrator. Do we? Jensen asked. He looked at her. For the first time he seemed uncertain. I hit him, he said. I lost control. Where? Jensen asked. He hesitated. Near the beach. Not on the beach, Jensen said. He shook his head. No. And then? She asked. Then I sat him down in the beach chair, he said, so that everyone could see exactly what it was that he had done. Jensen felt this slight tug in his stomach. The story fit too well. How did you transport him? She asked. He looked at her as if she had surprised him. In my car? Which one? Jensen asked. He named a model. Peterson made a note. Alone? Jensen asked. Yeah, how long did that take? She asked. He hesitated again. I don't know. Not long. Jensen nodded. She stood up. Thank you. Outside, she took a deep breath. Peterson followed her. He sounds credible, he said. He sounds exhausted, Jensen replied. Sometimes it's the same, Peterson said. Sometimes, Jensen said, but not always. The call came that very same morning, from a colleague in forensics. Jensen listened, but he did not say a single word until he had finally finished changing his clothes. "You've got an alibi," Peterson said as she hung up. Jensen nodded. "Security camera, a garage outside. Timestamp. He was there when Ben must have been dead." Peterson cursed under his breath. "Solid." "Really?" Jensen said, unconfirmed. They went back into the interrogation room. The man looked at them as they entered. There was something new in his eyes. Hope or defiance. "I recant," he said immediately. "I lied." Peterson slammed his hand on the table. "Why?" The man looked down at the floor. "Because I thought it would be easier." Benson sat back down. "Easier for whom?" "For everyone," he said. "For me? For you? Why did you want to do that for us?" Jensen asked. He was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Because I'm tired." Jensen let him talk. Tiredness was genuine. She didn't need any more questions. When they sat back in her office later, there was a different mood in the air. The feeling of security was gone. Instead, there was that familiar tipping point when a case changed direction. "The wrong guy?" Peterson said. Jensen nodded. "He was practical. He had motive," Peterson said. "Past, violent." "And that was precisely why," Jensen replied. "He was ideal." She thought of the beach chair, of the care, of the time. There was nothing about it that suggested a man who had simply exploded. "He wanted to disappear," Peterson said. "Or not to kill, but to finally be seen," Jensen added. She looked out of the window. The sky had cleared up in the meantime. The coast lay there, perfectly calm, as if it had absolutely nothing to do with all of this. "The case is tipping," Peterson said. "Yes," Jensen said. "And now it gets dangerous." "For whom did you?" Peterson asked. Jensen turned to face him. For those individuals who had assumed that they possessed complete control of the situation. She reached out to grasp the file and opened it wide. The confession had been deleted. The alibi had been duly noted, and the case was once again wide open. The wrong perpetrator had been exonerated, which made it undeniably clear that the true culprit was still at large. One who was not weary, but rather patient. It was not a sense of remorse that had brought him to the police station. Neely Jensen recognized that fact immediately. Remorse possessed a certain contrite, inward-looking quality. This man, however, appeared as someone who had spent a long time attempting to remain calm and understood that silence was no longer an option. He sat perched on the very edge of his chair, his upper body tilted slightly forward, as though he might jump up at any moment. His hands were not still. They searched for some, but they could find none. "I want to talk," he said, even before Jensen had managed to sit down. His voice was quiet, yet firm. Jensen sat down opposite him and kept the file closed. "Then talk." He swallowed hard. "It's not about guilt," he said. "Not mine. It's about the fact that this," he broke off, ran his hand over his face, "that this has gotten out of control." "What exactly?" Jensen asked. He looked at the door, as if expecting someone to come in. "The cartel," he finally said. The word sounded strange in this room. Too big for the coast, too heavy for beach chairs and seasonal prices. And yet it fit. Jensen said nothing. She let him speak. "At first it was simple," he continued. "Agreements, so that no one would be undercut, so that the beach would stay tight. That's how we told each other." "And later?" Jensen asked. "Later it became more binding," he said. "Anyone who didn't go along with it got into trouble." Jensen thought of the ruined former landlord, of decisions that had suddenly become the only option. "Wender was part of it," the man said. "He made it possible and used it." "Used it for what?" Jensen asked. The man laughed briefly, hard for everything. He told of meetings that were officially different, were unofficial, of fees that applied only to some, of stretches of beach that were handed out like rewards. Jensen listened, asked questions, guided carefully. She knew that fear was a rather bad storyteller, but it was an honest one nonetheless. Death was a warning, the man said, eventually. His voice was trembling now, but not for the one it had struck. For whom then? Jensen asked. He looked up. There was something in his eyes that she recognized. Recognition? For us? Jensen nodded slowly. For the wrong people? He nodded quickly. Yes, we misunderstood. We thought it was about making sure no one stepped out of line. But it was about something else. About what? Jensen asked. About control, he said. About who'd be left standing in the end. Jensen leaned back. The picture began to take shape. Not impulsive, not personal. Strategic. Who benefited? She asked. The man hesitated for a moment. Then he mentioned a name. Jensen did not show any emotion, but something inside him recoiled. The name fit, he thought, far too well. He was always the calmest, the man said. The most reasonable. Never threatened out loud. Never pushed. And that's exactly why, Jensen asked. That's exactly why. He confirmed while we were busy distrust each other, he had been expanding his position. Jensen thought of the USB stick, the protocols, the small shifts. The right one had benefited from it because everyone else had been distracted. Why are you coming now? She asked. The man rubbed his hands together because I realized that the next one, he broke off, that it could happen to anyone or anyone who was a nuisance, Jensen said. He nodded. She let him tell her everything. Names, agreements, mechanisms. It wasn't a clean confession, more like a spreading of fear. But it was enough. The cartel was starting to unravel, not because someone had woken up morally, but because the balance had been destroyed. After the man had finally left, Jensen remained sitting there for a moment. She heard the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway, the hum of the neon lights. The cartel did not collapse with a bang. It quietly disintegrated into cracks that had long been ignored. Tom Peterson came in. He's unpacked, he said. Jensen nodded. Not out of fear of Royce, Peterson said. The most honest motivation, Jensen replied. She stood up and went to the window. Outside, the beach lay quiet, as if it had nothing to do with all this. She knew better. It had been a warning, and now people were beginning to understand for whom. The right person had profited, Peterson said. Jensen looked out. For now, she said, but not for much longer. She turned round and reached for the file. The cartel collapsed, and with it the illusion that order was always harmless. The camp lay still, as if it had held its breath. Neela Jensen paused for a moment before entering. She knew this place well enough by now to realize that silence found here did not have anything comforting about it. Between the stacked beach chairs and the spare parts in the dark corners, something unsaid hung in the air. The truth had taken time to return here. Now it was here. Here, Tom Peterson said quietly, pointing to the ground. Jensen stepped closer. The concrete was lighter in one spot, almost washed out. Hastily cleaned, suitable for a place where no one else paid any attention to cleanliness. She crouched down and let her fingers glide over the rough surface. There was no visible blood left, but she knew that the place itself still remembered. An argument, she said more to herself than to Peterson. Yes, he replied. Witnesses have now confirmed it. Voices, loud, late at night. Jensen straightened up. The image formed in her mind's eye. Ribbons, self-assured as ever, was convinced that he was the one who determined all the rules. The other man, tense under pressure. A conversation that was no longer a conversation, but a demand. He blackmailed him, Jensen stated. Peterson nodded. gesturing toward the records and everything he had gathered. The culprit was no stranger or outsider, but a partner, someone who had played along for years, who had believed he understood the game perfectly, until Bender wanted more, wanting more and more as time went by, eventually demanding that the stakes be raised again and again. He wanted out, Peterson said, or at least renegotiate. Jensen snorted softly. Bender never negotiated. The argument had escalated. Words that had hardened. Threats, then the blow. Not a planned murder, not a cold decision, but a moment when something tipped over. A tool at hand. An arm that was faster than thought. Panic, Jensen said. Yes, Peterson confirmed. He thought he had only incapacitated him. Closed her eyes briefly. She had heard that sentence too often. The lie you tell yourself so you don't break down immediately. Winder had died, still in the camp. Not on the beach, not in the beach chair. Death had been banal, ugly, insignificant. And that was exactly what the perpetrator hadn't been able to bear. He knew that things couldn't stay that way, Peterson said. Jensen nodded. Not for someone like Bender. They continued walking between the rows of beach chairs. Jensen stopped in front of one that had been freshly repaired. New, weave, clean edges. She put her hand on it. The beach chair had been more than just a piece of furniture. It was a symbol, a backdrop, a stage. The beach chair was a production, she said. A final political act, Peterson added. Jensen looked at it. Not by the perpetrator. Peterson frowned. What do you mean? Bands, Jensen said slowly, even in death. She let the thoughts sink in. The perpetrator had transported the body. Yes, but the way bands had been sitting there, the order, the blanket, the shoes, it all spoke a language. Bender's language, control, message, publicity. He prepared it, Peterson said quietly. No, Jensen replied. He had calculated it. She turned around and looked Peterson straight in the eyes. Bender knew that he was making enemies for himself. He knew that the situation was becoming dangerous. That beach chair was his leverage, his final possibility to make everything visible to everyone. But he was already dead, Peterson objected. Yes, Jensen said, but his story certainly was not. One of the perpetrators had chosen the beach chair because it was obvious, because he knew people were looking there. He had hoped that the staging would reflect on him, that people would see Bender as a victim, perhaps even as a seafarer. A final political act, Peterson repeated, though certainly not in the classic sense of the term. Jensen nodded. Bender used his knowledge and shh, even unwillingly. They thought of the cartel, of the warning, of the wrong ones and the right ones. The perpetrator had believed he could save the game by playing it out. Instead, he had revealed it. He wanted to buy time, Peterson said. And lost everything, Jensen replied. The perpetrator had confessed in the meantime. Not immediately, not voluntarily, but completely. His voice had broken when he had realized that the staging would not protect him, that it had made him visible in the first place. Jensen stepped out of the camp into the open. The wind from the sea was cool, carrying the familiar smell of salt and seaweed. She thought of the beach chair the morning after, of the silence, of the swallowed secret. The truth is rarely to be found where one first looks for it, said Peterson from behind her. But it's almost always where someone wanted to show something, Jensen replied. She looked out toward the beach. The murder hadn't been an accident, but it wasn't a master plan either. It was the result of a system that had devoured itself, and a man who had believed he had everything under control. The truth had sat in the beach chair, quiet, orderly, and deadly clear. The beach was empty again. Not the early tense teacher that had accompanied Jensen in the days before, but a different kind of absence, one that smelled of order, of a new beginning. The tracks in the sand were fresh, smoothed out by machines and tides, as if the path had been swept away with a broad broom. The sea lay calm, indifferent as always. Basket number 17 stood freshly painted. In the sand, the wood bright, the weave immaculate, the number neatly affixed. It seemed like a promise or a lie. Jensen stopped and looked at it a moment longer than was necessary. She had learned that places changed when you looked at them. Not visible, not measurable, but tangible. Now Peterson waited a few steps behind her, giving her space. He knew by now that Jensen needed moments like these, not to conclude, but to file something that couldn't be neatly filed away. You replaced him, he said finally. Jensen nodded. Of course. Everything was replaced. People, objects, stories. People acted as if nothing had happened, as if the beach had never known anything but holidays and sunscreen. But it had seen more than people gave it credit for. Jensen slowly walked closer to the beach chair. She didn't touch it. She knew there was nothing left to feel. No cold, no memory in the material. And yet there was this knowledge that someone had sat here who was no longer alive. That something had been shown here that should not remain hidden. The perpetrator is in custody, said Peterson. Confession recorded. Everything clean, Jensen repeated quietly. She thought of the camp, of the argument, of the blow, of the panic, of a man who had believed he was part of a system that would protect him, and who had understood too late that systems knew no loyalty. The cartel is gone, said Peterson. At least as it was. Jensen looked out to sea. Cartels don't disappear, she said. They just change shape. The wind picked up, played with the sand, created fine lines that disappeared again immediately. The tide, the retreat, the phase in which everything that was otherwise hidden was exposed. Jensen liked these moments. They were honest. And ribbons? Peterson asked. Jensen was silent. The name hung heavy in the air. Earth Burr, the man with many phases, perpetrator and victim at the same time. Someone who had believed that power was something that could be held on to. He got what he wanted, she said finally. In a way he hadn't planned. Peterson looked at her. Publicity. Yes, Jensen said. And true. She turned around, leaving the beach chair behind her. Basket number 17 would be rented out again. People would sit in it, read, sleep, laugh. No one would think of the man who had died here. And that was fine. Places had to live on. People too. Do you think it's all over? Peterson asked. Jensen stopped, looked at him. No. He nodded. He had expected nothing else. They walked slowly back to the promenade. The first tourists appeared, cautious, searching. The season would begin, as it did every year, with new promises, with old patterns. Crimes leave traces, Jensen said after a while. Even if the tide erases them, Peterson added. Jensen smiled weakly, especially then, because she knew that not everything disappeared. Some traces remained deeper than footprints in the sand, in decisions, in mistrust, in mistrust, in the quiet knowledge that order was often only the surface. She thought of the widow, of the landlord who had spoken out of fear, of the former landlord who had been tired of all the people who had adapted in order to have peace. Peace was a deceptive goal. It had its price. When they reached the car, Jensen stopped once more and looked back. The beach seemed peaceful, innocent, almost beautiful. She knew that the sea would come again and again, that it would take and give without distinction. Low tide, she thought. Not the end, just the state. She got in and started the engine. The case was closed on paper, but in her mind it remained open, like so many others, because it had told more than just a murder of structures, of power, of people who thought they could control everything. The car started moving. The beach was left behind her. Oscar number 17 stood in the sand, freshly painted, ready for new stories. Jensen knew that some of them would be harmless, that others not, and that it was her job to watch closely even when the tide had already begun to wash everything away.